January 16, 1943. Portland Harbor, Oregon. Imagine standing on the misty docks that morning, the water beneath you a flawless mirror reflecting a pale, gray sky. The air is sharp and cold, each breath crystallizing into tiny clouds that vanish into the fog. Dock workers shuffled through the haze, their boots echoing softly against the timbers, preparing yet another Liberty ship for inspection. There she lay, the SS Schenectady, a vessel no older than a few weeks, freshly born from the Kaiser shipyards. Gleaming steel, welded instead of riveted, crafted with the speed and precision of an assembly line. She was supposed to be a triumph, the embodiment of American industrial power, a miracle of engineering. And yet, as the sun rose lazily over the harbor, that miracle teetered on the brink of disaster. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. At precisely 11:15 a.m., a sharp, metallic crack shattered the morning stillness. It sounded at first like a gunshot, then another, then a chorus of tearing steel that made hearts leap into throats. And then, in a moment no one could have predicted, the hull of the SS Schenectady began to bend as if the ship were alive, inhaling and exhaling with deadly intent. Deck plates rippled and warped before splitting open with a roar that seemed to shake the very air. A single, terrifying fracture raced from bow to stern, slicing through the ship with a precision that defied explanation. Men screamed, stumbled, and scrambled for safety as the vessel tore itself apart while still tethered to the pier. When the chaos subsided, the Schenectady was no longer whole. Two grotesque halves of twisted steel floated in the water, her keel broken, deck hanging like torn parchment over the dark harbor. There had been no storm, no torpedo, no explosion, nothing but the steel itself deciding to fail. Investigators descended within hours. Engineers crawled across the wreck, boots clanging against cold metal, eyes tracing the fracture lines. They were smooth, almost surgical, more shattering than tearing. Theories swirled. Substandard steel, design flaws, sabotage. But none explained why this violent rupture occurred, or why it wasn't an isolated case. Because it wasn't. The SS Schenectady was only the latest in a mounting series of disasters. In recent months, Liberty ships worldwide had begun splitting apart without warning. The SS John P. Gaines had snapped in half in the calm Alaskan waters, tossing her crew into the icy Pacific. The T-2 tanker SS Manhattan fractured so suddenly that sailors abandoned ship, certain they had been torpedoed. Between 1943 and 1944, over 2,500 vessels reported severe structural failures, cracks racing through hulls, decks peeling apart, steel plates shearing like fragile glass. 19 ships split entirely in two. 3 simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but slicks of oil and drifting debris. These were not acts of war. They were self-destruction ships undoing themselves, and every one of them shared the same design: welded, mass-produced, and built for speed. To grasp the scale of this crisis, one had to understand the Liberty ship itself. After Pearl Harbor, America faced a logistical nightmare. Hundreds of cargo ships were needed to ferry weapons, food, and fuel across 2 oceans. Traditional shipbuilding required 8 months per vessel, far too slow for the demands of total war. Enter Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before, yet promised the impossible. Cargo ships mass-produced like automobiles, assembled in weeks rather than months. At first, it seemed a stroke of genius. By late 1942, Kaiser's shipyards were rolling Liberty ships out every 42 days. Propaganda hailed this as industrial wizardry, Women welders replaced men who had gone to war, sparks flying beneath banners declaring, "Speed wins wars." But miracles come at a price. In the icy waters of the North Atlantic, welded hulls designed to save time behaved unpredictably. Small cracks that should have stopped at a seam raced unchecked, devouring steel in seconds. The very process that made these ships fast to build rendered them fatally brittle. Sailors whispered of strange pings echoing through the steel, eerily like glass under stress. Some refused to sleep below deck, fearing the night would swallow them if the hull gave way. Engineers called these fears superstition, but the fractures were very real. By the end of 1943, the Liberty Ship program, once America's crowning industrial achievement, had become a national embarrassment. Each fracture was more than a lost ship. It was a severed artery in the war effort, thousands of tons of cargo gone, hundreds of lives at risk. Yet the cause remained a mystery. Congress demanded answers. Naval architects blamed welders. Welders blamed steel mills. Steel mills blamed designers. And while the debate raged, more ships tore themselves apart. The miracle that had carried America's hopes across the seas was cracking under its own weight. And somewhere in a California shipyard, under flickering lamps and clouds of welding smoke, a woman nobody had heard of was about to notice what every expert had missed. Henry Kaiser had promised the impossible. In 1941, when the U.S. Maritime Commission asked him to build cargo ships, most laughed. A dam builder, not a naval architect? Surely a joke. He had poured concrete at Hoover Dam, not riveted steel. But Kaiser refused the conventional path. "We'll build them like cars," he said. And when America entered the war, turning the oceans into a battlefield, he delivered at breathtaking speed. In Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, shipyards were transformed. Gone were the slow rhythms of riveters hammering red-hot bolts. Instead, giant prefabrication sheds produced entire sections of hulls ready to weld. Sparks rained from scaffolds day and night. Conveyor belts delivered steel directly from mills to assembly lines. Floodlights turned midnight into noon. Ships that once took 8 months now emerged in 40 days or less. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Perry, was completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. Newspapers hailed it as the ship that beat the clock. Yet even miracles hide their flaws. The Liberty Ship was a compromise, designed for speed, not longevity. Welding was faster than riveting and lighter, but it introduced stress nobody fully understood. Riveted joints acted as natural crack stoppers. Welded seams created continuous metal sheets, strong under compression, but fragile under tension. In California's mild climate, this was invisible. The Richmond ships sailed smoothly, their hulls shining. But in the freezing Atlantic, steel lost its ductility. Tiny imperfections could erupt into catastrophe. Kaiser's shipyards, in their quest for speed, made such flaws inevitable. Small crews, many women, newly trained welders, proud of their work-welded long seams in single passes. As metal cooled unevenly, residual stress locked into the structure. By the time a Liberty ship was completed, its hull carried millions of invisible pounds of tension, coiled like a spring, waiting for the moment to snap. Yet in 1942, no one perceived the danger. To the public, Kaiser's shipyards were temples of progress, monuments to America's industrial might. Newsreels rolled across cinema screens, showing smiling women in coveralls, sparks flying like fireworks, all set to the cheerful rhythm of swing music. It was a simple message, yet a powerful one. America had weaponized its factories, and Henry Kaiser was the man at the helm. The man who had solved the nation's logistical nightmare, When President Roosevelt toured the Richmond Yard, he didn't just shake hands. He declared it living proof that democracy could outproduce tyranny itself. But as the cameras stopped rolling, the cracks began to appear. At first, they were small, almost laughable. Hairline fractures near deck hatches, tiny splits around cargo openings. Engineers waved them off as cosmetic blemishes. Yet the fissures grew. On voyages, crews heard sudden, eerie pops, the groaning of steel releasing hidden tension. Leaks appeared where welded seams met sharp corners. By late 1942, entire sections of hulls began to split apart, without storm, without enemy fire, without warning. Sailors spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the ships themselves were alive, tearing apart from within. Naval investigators swarmed the yards like ants, searching for answers. Unskilled labor, faulty welding rods, poor supervision, each received blame in turn. Orders flew down. Double-check every seam, retrain the workforce, reinforce the hulls. But nothing halted the failures. Every probe birthed new theories, each more confusing than the last. Metallurgists examined the steel with microscopes, spectrometers, and testing rigs, but the alloy was perfect. Welds passed inspection. The numbers promised invincibility. And yet, reality whispered a darker truth. Fear began to seep into the yards. Sailors wrote home of cursed ships. Dock workers murmured that the Liberty hulls were haunted. Some captains outright refused to take certain vessels to sea. The Maritime Commission quietly tinkered with designs, reinforcing straps here, modified hatch corners there, even riveted joints reintroduced experimentally. But America could not afford to slow. War raged on two oceans. Ships, not theories, were needed. By 1943, the crisis could no longer be contained. Two vessels broke apart while still in harbor. Questions leaked into the press. Kaiser's Miracle teetered on the brink of collapse. Government panels, expert committees, metallurgical reviews, all converged, all left empty-handed. The steel remained opaque to their instruments, its betrayals invisible to educated eyes. And then, in one Richmond shipyard, on the graveyard shift, surrounded by sparks and shadows, a single welder began to see what no engineer ever did. Night after night, she watched the metal breathe, the seams warp, the plates twist under her torch. The others ignored it. She could not. She didn't need a degree. She needed only hands, eyes, and instinct. The ships were being built wrong. Long before history remembered her name, Bessie Hamill was just another welder in a sea of overalls and fire at Richmond Shipyard No. 3. The night shift began at 10:40 p.m. and stretched until the first pale glow of dawn touched the San Francisco Bay. Smoke hung thick in the air, heavy with molten flux and scorching steel. Liberty ships loomed like iron cathedrals under the floodlights, their skeletal frames reaching toward the dark sky. To most workers, the heat and noise were endless, a brutal industrial symphony keeping pace with war. To Bessie, it was alive. She had spent 8 months there, long enough to distinguish the song of a perfect weld from a failing one. A clean seam hummed steadily. A stressed joint rang higher, sharper, like a violin string pulled too tight. At first, she dismissed the warnings. Foreman said minor distortions were routine, part of the process. Yet Bessie could not ignore the subtle warping of massive steel plates, 20 feet long, an inch thick. When cooled, they bowed inward, as though resisting their own shape. Where others compensated with brute force hammers, clamps, faster welding. Bessie observed. She marked the movement of metal, sketched crude diagrams in her lunch pail, and noted the sequence of heat zones and seam placement. Slowly, a pattern emerged. This was not chance nor poor steel. Every shift followed a ritual. Edges first, center last, long continuous seams drawn like lines from one end of a plate to another. Each cooling weld contracted, pulling surrounding metal tighter, locking tension into the structure. By the time the next seam was laid, the stress was trapped. It was like tightening the center bolts of a wheel before the outer ones, a formula for imbalance, a recipe for disaster. She tried to alert her foreman. He laughed. "The engineers know what they're doing," he said. "Just run your torch and keep it straight." Pressing further only earned her a warning. Meet your quota 20 feet of seam per hour. But Bessie had seen the truth. The steel spoke, and she listened. Speed ruled the yard, not precision. Supervisors timed welds with stopwatches, not stress gauges. Blueprints dictated where to weld, not how. The engineers designing the ships had never stood beneath one, never felt the vibration as plates cooled. They worked from numbers. She worked from sound, heat, and instinct. In November 1943, after her shift, she stayed behind. The floor was littered with scrap, test pieces, discarded steel. She experimented, welding plates in different sequences, edges first, center first, alternating sides. Cooling revealed the truth. Edges, first plates warped, center first plates remained flat. The difference was undeniable. The next morning, she showed her samples to her foreman. He glanced, shrugged, and walked away. "You're a welder, not an engineer," he said. "Don't waste company material." But Bessie was far from done. Over the next 2 weekends, she ran more tests, tracking temperature drops, chalking stress buildup near corners and openings. The problem wasn't steel, it was sequence. The engineers had unknowingly devised a system that guaranteed internal tension in every ship. Word spread among the night shift. Some scoffed, others quietly nodded. And Bessie, she was just beginning to understand the scale of what she had discovered. "Those plates are fighting back," one welder had whispered, eyes wide as tiny sparks flew. "I've seen them pop like rifle shots." But no one dared speak too loudly. In the war effort, doubt was treason, and questions were dangerous. Production was patriotism. Delay was disloyalty. Yet she couldn't let it go. Every time a ship fractured, she saw the faces of the welders who had labored on it. Thousands of hours beneath fire and smoke, their pride melting into shame, as headlines announced the latest ship torn apart at sea. It wasn't their fault, it was the process. And if she stayed silent, no one would act. So, in November 1943, she did the unthinkable. She requested a meeting with her supervisors, a direct challenge to the engineering department's procedures, a breach of the chain of command that could have ended her career. On the form, under purpose of meeting, she wrote a single stark line: stress from improper welding sequence causing hull failure. The supervisors arrived expecting complaints. What they encountered was a demonstration. On the table lay her test plates. She explained the heat flow through steel, the tension trapped as seams contracted, and how an altered welding sequence, starting from the center and alternating sides, could relieve that stress. No equations, no jargon, just the voice of someone who had lived inside the problem, hands tracing the lines of her plates. They dismissed her politely. One man called her theory impractical, another blamed cheap steel. But one older supervisor, Charles Horton, lingered after the others had left. He had seen enough shipyards to know that tiny details often carried monumental consequences. "Show me your weld," he said. That night, Horton stood beside her. He watched as the plate shifted, as she paused between passes to let the metal relax, as the seam cooled evenly instead of curling upward. When she finished, the section lay flat. Horton stood silently for a long moment, then whispered, "Do that again." It was the first step of an experiment that would rewrite American shipbuilding. The night a welder's ridiculous idea began proving every expert wrong. By late November, whispers spread quietly through the Richmond yards. Someone on the night shift had defied the official procedure. Supervisors scoffed. Engineers called it idle talk. But soon, her name was on every lip. The welder with the ridiculous idea. To the leaders of Kaiser's empire, it sounded absurd. The Liberty ship program had been scrutinized by the finest metallurgists and naval architects, examined by Congress, analyzed by universities. How could a single woman with a torch see what thousands of engineers had missed? Yet Horton was not laughing. He ordered a controlled test. In a secluded corner of Yard 3, Bessie and a small team prepared 2 identical steel panels, 12 feet long, 2 inches thick. One would follow the standard method edges first, long continuous seams, rapid passes to meet quotas. The other would follow her sequence. Center first, alternating sides, never overheating any single zone. Observers included Horton, 2 metallurgists, and a young engineer scribbling doubts on a clipboard. The difference was visible before the welds cooled. The standard plate twisted along its center line, edges buckling under the heat's inward pull. The Bessie plate stayed flat, showing only a faint ripple in the floodlight's reflection. Measurements confirmed it. Distortion in her panel was less than half that of the conventional weld. They repeated the test: thicker plates, longer seams, more complex joints. Each time, the result was the same. Within a week, metallurgists joined the effort. Strain gauges measured the residual stress, the invisible tension locked into steel as it cooled. The readings stunned everyone. Traditional sequences left over 30,000 pounds per square inch at hatch corners and deck edges. Bessie's method kept it under 12,000 psi. The difference was measurable, undeniable. The young engineer whispered, "That's impossible." Horton replied calmly, "It's happening anyway." By week's end, word reached Henry Kaiser. For months, he had been under relentless pressure over Liberty ship failures. Congress demanding answers, the Maritime Commission insisting on accountability. Now, in a single test bay, an untrained welder had produced both a problem and its solution. Kaiser requested a full briefing. Bessie's plates were brought to the main yard for formal demonstration. Metallurgists from the University of California examined them, measuring stress patterns and microfractures under magnification. When pressure tests were applied, the standard welds cracked along familiar lines, the same fractures that had doomed ships at sea. The Bessie welds held. That night, Kaiser sat in his office, surrounded by reports, schedules, and cost charts. Halting the line meant pausing the miracle of mass production. 90,000 workers, 24-hour shifts, hundreds of subcontractors, all built around speed. Retraining welders, rewriting manuals, redesigning every section. This would slow production at the very moment the Navy needed ships most. But the data was undeniable. The Liberty ship failures were not random. They were built into the process. Kaiser did not hesitate. "Stop the line," he commanded. "Start again. Retrain them all." Overnight, shipyards transformed from assembly lines into classrooms. Experienced welders became instructors, teaching a new method. Start in the center, alternate sides. Never run continuous seams longer than 4 feet. It had a name now: balanced welding sequence. By every industrial measure, it was madness. Production dropped 30% the first week. Critics called it proof that Kaiser's miracle had always been a fluke. Newspapers reported training delays. Congressional investigators circled like vultures. Yet in the test bays, the results were undeniable. Engineers began to understand the physics behind her method. Steel was not a simple solid. It was crystalline, its molecules expanding under heat and contracting as they cooled. Continuous seams created tension with nowhere to go. Once cooled, That tension became a ticking time bomb. In warm climates, the steel could absorb it. In the icy waters of the Atlantic, steel revealed its hidden weakness. Crystals, once flexible, turned brittle in the cold. A tiny crack at a hatch corner could trigger a chain reaction, racing along the hull at nearly the speed of sound. The solution, when it came, was breathtaking in its simplicity. Let the steel breathe. Weld from the center outward. By doing so, the metal could release tension gradually, flowing naturally toward the edges. Alternating sides balanced heat distribution. Short, staggered welds prevented localized stress. No new tools were needed, no exotic alloys, no extra hands, only a new rhythm, one that obeyed the laws of heat and contraction rather than defying them. By December 1943, the first full-scale hull section crafted with this method was ready. When test teams subjected it to simulated Atlantic storms, it held perfectly. No distortion, no micro cracks, no ominous pops or groans. Even the most skeptical engineers had to admit it. The ridiculous idea worked. Henry Kaiser's next move transformed a local experiment into an industrial revolution. The next generation of ships, the Victory class, would be born from the lessons of Liberty's failures. Rounded hatch corners replaced square ones to eliminate stress points. Hulls were constructed in smaller modular sections, allowing precise control over welding sequences. The steel itself evolved, a refined alloy with less carbon, a touch more manganese, and a trace of nickel to preserve toughness in frigid waters. An entire philosophy of shipbuilding had shifted, sparked not by a scientist or admiral, but by a woman who refused to ignore the song of bending steel. In January 1944, veteran welders scoffed as new trainees practiced the center-out method on sample plates. Superstition, they called it. Waste of time. But within weeks, even the cynics could see the difference. Plates cooled flat, seams hummed quietly, and the creaks and groans of stressed hulls vanished. For the first time in months, the yard felt safe. Victory ships would soon take shape, proving Bessie Hamel's insight and rewriting the rules of steelwork for generations. By February 1944, the Richmond shipyards no longer sounded like chaos. Welding torches still roared, steel still clanged, but now they followed a rhythm almost musical, a cadence of steps and pauses. The yards had become a hybrid of classroom, laboratory, and factory. 90,000 workers, welders, fitters, machinists, electricians were learning a new language of steel, authored by a woman who still punched the night shift time card. Kaiser's temporary halt in production had seemed a public relations disaster. Reporters mocked him. Politicians called it industrial suicide. The Navy fretted over lost tonnage as Allied offensives loomed. But Kaiser held firm. "Speed without strength is nothing," he told supervisors. "We're not building coffins, we're building lifelines." Posters appeared in every shed. Center out, never in. Laminated cards detailed each welder's numbered sequence for their assigned plates. Before striking the first arc, workers traced the sequence with a gloved finger. Instructors like Bessie, now reluctantly promoted to trainer, paced the rows, monitoring heat, timing welds, ensuring plates cooled evenly between passes. Every 10 welds, a plate entered a stress relief oven, heated above 2,000 degrees, then cooled slowly overnight. What had once been a frantic race became a choreography of precision. At first it felt painfully slow. Ships that had once launched in 42 days now took nearly twice as long. Schedules slipped. Supplies piled up in the rail yards. Critics whispered that Kaiser had lost his touch. Then, something extraordinary happened. Errors vanished. Hull sections fit perfectly on the first try. Weld rejection rates plummeted from 15% to 3%. Test plates endured hammer strikes and ice baths without a single fracture. The stress had disappeared. The first full Victory-class hull built under the new system came together in March 1944. A prototype, not yet destined for service, it surpassed every expectation. Ultrasonic scans revealed 0 micro cracks. Its flawless alignment earned it the nickname Straight Ship. Kaiser called it proof of concept. Washington called it luck. He answered, "Then let's see if luck can be repeated." Yard 2 prepared for full-scale production using the modular system. Unlike Liberty ships, built upward from a central keel, Victory ships would assemble like a puzzle. Massive prefabricated blocks, welded independently, then joined in a single, precise operation. Each block had its own sequence, team, and timetable. Bow sections, for instance, consisted of 50 subassemblies, bottom plates, bulkheads, deck frames, all welded center out, stress relieved, and carefully measured before final joining. Inside the covered prefabrication sheds, the process resembled an automotive plant more than a shipyard. Conveyors moved sections between stations. Overhead cranes lifted modules into alignment jigs. Teams rotated on a strict schedule. 30 minutes welding, 10 minutes rest, 5 minutes inspection. A central control tower tracked every move with chalkboards and clocks. Lagging sections were corrected instantly. To the untrained eye, it appeared mechanical. To those who understood, it was a live steel breathing in perfect rhythm. On May 12, 1944, Richmond Yard 2 embarked on its most ambitious test. 17 prefabricated modules, representing 85% of a hull, were aligned and lowered into place. Gantry cranes swung overhead, positioning each block with precision measured in inches. Sparks erupted as hundreds of welders connected the modules, each following the center-out sequence Bessie had pioneered. 11 hours later, the skeleton of a Victory ship stood complete. For the next 5 days, the yard became a ballet of coordination. Electricians threaded cables through pre-drilled conduits. Pipe fitters installed pre-measured tagged steam lines. Every movement, every action, followed the rhythm of the steel, the heartbeat of Bessie Hamill's revolution. Painters moved behind the welders, sealing each section the moment it cooled. The engine already tested off-site was lowered into place, mounts aligning perfectly on the first try. Unlike the chaotic Liberty builds of the previous year, there were no last-minute corrections, no warped plates, no emergency re-welds. Every measurement fit like a key sliding into its lock. At precisely 5:11 a.m. on June 27, 1944, the hull of the SS Benjamin Warner slid into the water. A crowd had gathered along the pier, tense and silent, as though the ship might betray them, like so many Liberty ships before it. But the Warner floated straight and level, her hull lines gleaming under the morning sun. When she completed her sea trials 2 days later, not a single stress crack appeared. The silence that had gripped the pier turned to thunderous applause. From keel to completion in just 5 days and 11 hours, a record not of reckless speed, but of perfection through precision. Kaiser's team called it the 5-day miracle. Headlines celebrated a reborn industry, shipyards reborn. Washington ended its investigations. The Maritime Commission issued orders for 500 Victory ships built on the same model. Even skeptics in the Navy's Bureau of Ships admitted the impossible. Mass production married to structural integrity. Yet behind the statistics lay something deeper. The 5-day miracle was not merely an engineering triumph, it was a revolution of mindset. For the first time, industrial America saw that speed and quality were not enemies, but partners when guided by process, not pressure. The balanced welding sequence proved that discipline could outperform desperation. For Bessie Hamill, the victory was quiet, almost invisible. Her name never appeared in the official reports. The documents credited a revised welding methodology developed at Richmond Shipyard. She remained a shift supervisor, punching her card, welding when needed. But the men who had once laughed now saluted as she passed. They called her Boss Bess. The ships that followed carried her unseen legacy across 2 oceans. The Victory Fleet became the backbone of Allied logistics, delivering tanks to Normandy, fuel to Okinawa, and food to liberated Europe. Not one vessel split in half. Not one failed from brittle fracture. The design was so robust that many Victory ships would sail for decades after the war, long after Liberty ships had rusted into memory. In Richmond, someone painted a new phrase above the main gate. It was not a slogan. It was truth carved into the workers' souls. We slowed down to win. The 5-day miracle was not the triumph of speed. It was the redemption of patience. A nation obsessed with production had learned from a welder's ridiculous idea that true progress begins the moment you stop and listen to the steel. When the first Victory ships began crossing the Atlantic in late 1944, they carried more than cargo. They carried proof. The invisible science of stress, heat, and human observation could alter the course of a war. The forces that had destroyed the Liberty ship's temperature, tension, fatigue, were still present. But now, for the first time, they were understood, controlled, and harnessed. Engineers could quantify, in numbers and physics, why these ships held together where others had failed. The breakthrough began with the steel itself. Liberty ships had been made from standard carbon-manganese alloy, adequate in mild climates, but catastrophic in cold seas. Below 40 ground, the steel's internal structure stiffened, losing ductility and behaving more like glass than metal. A tiny flaw, no wider than a human hair, could trigger a fracture that raced hundreds of feet along welded plates. Kaiser's metallurgists responded with a new alloy, killed steel. The name was as brutal as the process. During smelting, aluminum removed dissolved oxygen, killing the steel's reactivity and preventing gas bubbles that weakened the structure. Manganese levels were adjusted, and a trace of nickel, just 0.25% added low-temperature toughness. Expensive, yes. Transformative, absolutely. Tests at the University of California showed the effect. The transition temperature, the point where steel shifts from ductile to brittle, dropped from roughly 40 degrees in Liberty steel to just 5 degrees in Victory steel. That 35-degree difference meant survival in the freezing North Atlantic, where seawater hovered just above freezing. Liberty steel shattered like porcelain. Victory steel flexed, absorbed the shock, and held firm. Metallurgy was only half the story. Geometry was the other. Liberty ships had square hatch openings and sharp bulkhead angles. They were easy to assemble, but disastrous under stress. When waves bent the hull, these corners multiplied forces 3- or 4-fold. Combined with residual welding stress, they became ticking fracture points. Victory ships replaced every sharp corner with smooth curves. Rounded hatches distributed stress evenly, reducing spikes from 4 times normal to less than 2. Cosmetic? Perhaps. But the numbers proved otherwise. A Liberty ship facing a 40-foot wave could see stress spikes exceeding 60,000 psi near a square hatch far beyond the steel's limit. The same wave on a Victory ship generated just 25,000 psi, well within safe margins. Even the seams were redesigned. Liberty ships were welded continuously from bow to stern, a single uninterrupted structure. Fast, yes, but vulnerable. Once a crack began, it could run the entire hull. Victory ships introduced deliberate imperfection, riveted joints at strategic points. These mechanical crack arresters acted like fire breaks in a forest. If a fracture began, It lost energy at the riveted seam, stopping propagation before catastrophe. Engineers called it defensive design. Strength is not perfection, but the capacity to fail safely. Inside, Victory ships were layered armor. Frames were doubled at critical stress zones. Bulkheads aligned with the balanced welding sequence, so steel's natural expansion and contraction followed predictable paths. Deckplate thicknesses were recalculated not to brute force strength, but to balance stress across surfaces. The result? Harmony between material, method, and motion. Tests at the Naval Materials Laboratory in 1944 were staggering. Liberty-class sections cracked at around 32,000 psi. Victory-class sections endured up to 54,000 psi before microfractures appeared, and even then, cracks stopped within inches instead of racing unchecked. At sea, these numbers meant survival. Between June 1944 and August 1945, 531 Victory ships entered service. Not one suffered catastrophic hull failure. Minor surface cracks were caught during inspections and repaired. Meanwhile, dozens of Liberty ships were retired or lost to structural failure. The contrast was undeniable. The data vindicated Kaiser's decision, but more than that, it proved Bessie Hamel's intuition correct. The problem had never been bad steel or sloppy labor. It was the silent physics of heat and contraction, multiplied by geometry and ignorance. The solution was not more force or faster work, but balance and understanding. The steel itself needed time to breathe. As the war pressed into the Pacific, Victory ships became the backbone of Allied logistics. They sailed Arctic convoys to Murmansk, endured typhoons in the South China Sea, and delivered supplies to Normandy under fire. Their hulls flexed, groaned, and shuddered, but they did not break. Sailors who once feared the night now slept confident in their ship's integrity. Engineers began calling them forgiving ships, vessels built not just to perform, but to endure human error, storms, and time. Long after the war, their legacy rippled through industry. Welding sequences inspired bridge construction, oil pipelines, and even early nuclear power plants. Control, sequence, stress. Every skyscraper beam, offshore platform, and pressure vessel carried a piece of that discovery. By the time Victory ship number 500 launched in 1945, the mystery haunting shipbuilders for years was finally solved. Liberty ships had failed because their creators believed strength came from rigidity. Victory ships endured because their makers learned that true strength comes from flexibility. Steel is alive. Steel moves, expands, contracts, resists, and remembers. And once you learn how it breathes, you can build anything to last. When the war ended in 1945, the shipyards fell silent for the first time in years. The great cranes stood like dormant giants against the California sky, their hooks swaying gently over dry docks that no longer echoed with hammer strikes or the roar of welding torches. The Richmond yards had produced more than 700 ships, a miracle of steel, sweat, and human endurance that helped turn the tide of history. And yet, as peace returned, the people who had built that miracle drifted quietly back to their lives, uncelebrated and mostly forgotten. Among them was Bessie Hamel. She clocked out one last time in the summer of 1946. There was no ceremony, no photograph, no newspaper clipping. Her final paycheck was folded neatly in a brown envelope. She walked home through the quiet streets of the company town she had helped build, hung her gloves by the door, and left the war behind. As far as anyone knew, her work was done. Even the engineers who had studied her methods moved on. The Victory ship program wound down. The yards closed. The world turned its gaze to jet engines, atomic power, and the dawn of the computer age. Liberty ships that had survived were scrapped or sold. Victory ships continued their quiet duty, hauling grain to Europe under the Marshall Plan, ferrying troops to Korea, delivering supplies through the Cold War. Decades later, when the last of these ships was finally retired, inspectors were astonished. After millions of miles and decades of service, their hulls showed no catastrophic cracks. Bessie never knew it, but the method she had discovered had already outlived the war. In 1947, the American Welding Society codified these lessons in the Structural Welding Code, a technical manual that quietly immortalized her insights. Buried within its pages was the balanced welding sequence, diagrams mirroring those Bessie had drawn by hand years earlier. The code made the principles mandatory for critical structural welds in shipbuilding, bridges, and pressure vessels. It did not name her, and it never would, but her influence was everywhere. When engineers designed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 1970s, 800 miles of welded steel carrying hot oil through sub-zero tundra, they relied on stress relief procedures born in the Richmond yards. When the Golden Gate Bridge underwent its seismic retrofit in the 1990s, welding teams followed computer simulations based on the same center-outward principles. Even nuclear reactors, with pressure vessels enduring extreme heat and radiation, incorporated stress relief ovens remarkably similar to those Kaiser had installed during the Victory program. Each modern marvel carried, in its steel and seams, the ghost of a welder who refused to accept that this is how it's done. In the decades after the war, historians wrote volumes about Henry Kaiser, calling him the father of mass production at sea. They wrote of his innovations, his yards, his workers. But Bessie Hamel's name rarely appeared. She lived quietly in Sacramento, working odd jobs, raising 2 children, never mentioning that she had once changed the way the world built ships. When she died in 1987, her obituary ran 3 sentences. She had worked in wartime shipyards and enjoyed gardening. Nothing hinted that the welding code followed by every modern engineer carried her fingerprints. And yet, her legacy endures. Not in monuments or medals, but in practice. Every welder who lays a bead on a skyscraper column and follows center out, alternate sides is speaking her language. Every inspector, measuring residual stress with an ultrasonic gauge, is verifying her discovery. Every engineer designing for flexibility instead of rigidity walks the path she revealed. The story of the ridiculous welder is more than technical innovation. It is a reminder that progress does not always flow from the top. Sometimes it begins in the hum of a night shift, in the patience to observe, and in the courage to say, "This isn't right." Bessie Hamel did not invent welding, metallurgy, or engineering theory. What she gave the world was simpler, rarer. She taught it how to listen. Modern engineering now has a word for it: feedback. The idea that the process itself can teach the designer, that the hand holding the torch knows things a blueprint never will. From Toyota's lean production lines to NASA's fault-tolerant systems, the principle runs deep. Respect the worker, observe the process, and let reality correct theory. These were the seeds planted by one woman's stubborn question in a wartime shipyard. Today, a handful of preserved Victory ships still float in harbors around the world museums of steel and memory. Visitors walk their decks, read plaques about wartime production, marvel at how these vessels survived when others failed. Most never notice the weld seams running along the hulls, smooth, even, unbroken. But for those who listen closely, the steel whispers her story. We were built by someone who cared enough to ask why. If you believe ordinary people can change history, let that thought stay with you. Every bridge you cross, every tower that stands, every ship that sails owes a silent debt to a woman who refused to stop listening. Somewhere in every machine that moves and every structure that endures, there is another ridiculous idea waiting to be heard.